Hi, I'm Brad, and today we're going to have a look at winter groundbait mixes for silverfish. So I've got three different mixes I want to show you. I've got sort of my go-to sort of skimmer winter mix, I've got a more roachy mix, and then a shallow water mix as well. So three different ones to consider. I think it's really important that before you go this winter that you do a bit of research on the venue, because that will influence quite heavily which groundbait you mix up for the day. Obviously you might mix up a couple, but normally you go with one predominant route, and I've got sort of my go-to mix I'm going to show you. Now there's different ways to mix groundbait. You can mix it the night before, which I'd recommend most of the time. That makes it a bit more inert, so a bit more inactive, which if you're targeting sort of skimmers and things like that, then that's quite a plus. So the particles stay more on the bottom as they're not all fizzing up through the columns, and it sort of keeps the fish nice and low and down. So sort of a good idea. You can mix it up on the morning, just make sure you do it very first thing when you get there if you can, and I'd recommend using something like this. So use one of your drills from home, and then a bit like a plasterer's whisk. You can buy some tackle shops for mixing your groundbait. Saves a lot of time and mixes it really efficiently as well, much better than you could do with your hand. I've got my water here in a little sort of throw bucket, and sort of all ready to go. I've got my riddle as well. Now riddling's really important. The whisks give it quite a nice finish. It's not as lumpy as if you do it by hand, but still give it a good riddle. I normally pass it through a couple of times just before I use it, and you end up with something like this, a nice fine sort of a little bit on the dry side mix. I've purposely mixed it a little bit dry because when I add sort of particles later, things like pinkies and dead maggots and casters, there's a bit of moisture in there, and that will sort of make it a bit wet again, so it sort of counteracts the fact it's a little bit dry. So the first mix, my sort of go-to mix, is F1 Dark and Thatchers. So particularly on a venue like we're at today, so we're at Cooper's Lakes today in Derby, which is quite a deep venue, so we've got like on a top four in most of the rigs. So what's that, about 8-9 foot deep in places, I think, in the deepest spot. And these two mixes are great for that sort of depth, and for skimmers as well, because there's a lot of fish meal in this. So it's really good for those skimmers and bream. You do get the odd carp as well, but as it gets colder they do tend to switch off, thankfully. But there's a reason why I use Thatchers, which I'll explain. So F1 Dark's full of fish meal, it's a lovely mix, and you probably could use this by itself really. But the advantage of adding Thatchers in is that binding quality. So Thatchers is a stickier mix, so I mix them pretty much 50-50, sort of a bag of this and then half a bag of this because they're bigger bags, and sort of whisk it together and then add the water after. So Thatchers is also full of fish meal, it's got lots of goodness in there, and it's very sticky, so for deep water it keeps it together a bit nicer. Hence why also I mix it on slightly on the drier side, so if you go a bit too wet then it can get quite claggy. And I want it to break up once it hits the bottom. So my next mix, so if you're at a venue that's got a few more roach in and you want to go down more the roach route, you will catch roach on this, but something with a bit more cereal in, a bit more activity, a bit more fizz going on, then you can get a different mix for that. And something like black roach is great, which is from the So Natural range from Sonia. You can sort of combine it with a bit of sweet skimmer, or you could combine it with Thatchers or F1 Dark as well. Depending on sort of how deep the venue you're fishing. So black roach and Thatchers might be quite a good deep water roach mix, for example. So I'd sort of mix and match depending on what I'm going for. And then lastly, if you're on sort of a shallow venue and you're targeting skimmers in particular, particularly them small ones, something like Super Crush Expander is absolutely brilliant. I absolutely love this groundbait. It's very, very fish mealy. It's just ground up expander pellets, as it says. They're full of sort of fish meal, so the skimmers and the bream in particular absolutely love it. And it's great for shallow venues in particular because it breaks down quite quickly. Sort of is quite fizzes a lot in the water. So as it goes through the water column, it instantly starts to break down. If you're at a venue any deeper than probably 5 foot, it's probably not even going to reach the bottom properly. It's going to break up and slowly float down. But it adds loads of attractions in the layer. So sometimes I'll add a bit of this, even at a venue like this, if you want to draw something down. But I wouldn't use a predominant Super Crush mix because I don't think much would actually reach the bottom. But a really, really good option if you're fishing a shallow water venue. Right, so once you've picked your mix, so in my case today I've gone for my F1 Dark and Thatchers, sort of my go-to mix if I'm not sure. I've mixed them up, and like I said, I've mixed it slightly on the dry side. Now the next step is to add things in if you want to do that. You have to think about the weather, the fish stocks, is where your research comes in a little bit as well. And if it's going to be like a really cold day, you don't want tons of feed particles in there. You want it to be, you could just do neat groundbait with the very odd sort of dead pinky or something like that. But today, because it's quite mild, even for sort of late November now, still quite mild, and I'm going to put plenty of bits in there. So I'm going to put some casters, some dead maggots, and maybe some pinkies in there, and some bits like that. So they're all going to go on. I think what I normally do is I normally have a separate bucket from this one, or like a nice big bait tub, and I put a bit in separately and mix a little bit at a time. The advantage of this is you can keep it somewhere nice and dry, so if it's raining on the day, sort of keeps it in good condition, and then sort of as you mix in that bit, if a bit goes wrong, then it's not the end of the world, you've only got what's in the tub. Now, adding things in, you can put various different additives in. For example, things like bait boosters or additives are quite good, especially for bream. Things like the sweet smells can work really well for them. If you're going to add stuff like this in, pop it in your water. A bit of a tip, pop it in your water, swirl it around in your water before you mix your ground bait, and then it's distributed evenly. If you pour it in neat, then it sort of can group in areas, so I prefer to add it into the water before I mix the ground bait. Once you've got all your particles in, give it a good mix round, then you're sort of ready to go. You've got to think about how much you want to feed at the start then. Right, so you've picked what ground bait you're going to use, you've mixed it up and added all your particles in, and the last step is feeding it now. So there's different ways of feeding it and different approaches you can make. A lot of it's trial and error until you know a venue a little bit better, but quite often the most common approach is to make a ball, probably like a Jaffa orange size to begin with, and sort of feed it through a cupping kit. You can use smaller nuggets and feed it through a cad pot, particularly on shallow venues, that works quite well. But for the venue like today, where it's got a bit of depth, I think I'm going to feed one ball at the start and sort of feel my way in, particularly as it's a cold day. So I've got my cupping kit, I'm going to group a bit together and make a ball. Now, I'm going to squeeze it fairly tight, but not too much. Like I say, there's a bit of depth today, so I don't want it too loose. Depending on the venue, you might want to just give it a very slight squeeze just to form a ball, but it's going to fall apart really easily. This one I've squeezed together a little bit harder just because of the depth. I want the fish to work a bit harder in breaking that bait up and for it to reach the bottom intact. And then I'm just going to pop it in my cupping kit and then ship out and feed. After that, you can sort of use a cad pot to loose feed a few maggots. You might want to fire with a catapult, which works quite well. A lot of venues, particularly depending on the species you're targeting, like roach and eyed and fish like that, love sort of particles coming through the water, particularly firing a few maggots in. That's always a good tip as well. So I think that's the last step really. So hopefully that's helped. Hopefully you'll catch you a few more silvers this winter.